Welkom bij de Nieuwe Wereld, verdiepende gesprekken in een tijd van verandering. Mijn naam is Jelle van Baardewijk en vandaag heb ik een bijzondere gast, namelijk Rod Dreher uit de Verenigde Staten. Hij is de schrijver van het boek The Benedict Option en hij is een vrij populaire auteur in de christelijke gemeenschap. Je zou kunnen zeggen hij is wat communautair, gemeenschapsgericht en ook wel conservatief georiënteerd. En het leek me leuk om hem uit te nodigen nu hij in Nederland is. Hij is een soort van verbonden aan een intellectueel instituut in Hongarije. Daar zal hij zo meteen nog wat meer over vertellen. Hij was in Brussel, nu in Nederland en hij leeft vrij internationaal, dus hij gaat ook weer snel terug naar Amerika. En het leek ons hartstikke leuk om hem hier in Leiden te verwelkomen. Daarom ga ik nu ook verder op het Engels. Welcome here in Leiden.
It's great to be here. I'm hoping that on my way back to the train station I will have an Andreas Kinneging sighting. Do you think it's possible?
Oh, you know Andreas Kinneging. He's actually never been my guest yet.
Yet. No,
yeah.
I met him once and interviewed him 20 years ago. I was a writer for a National Review magazine in New York back then, and this was after Pim Fortuyn was killed. And I told my editors, look, I know something about the Netherlands, and this is really a bombshell, and maybe I should go there and write about how the Netherlands has changed from being once a very middle-class conservative society to being quite on the left. And as part of that investigation, I went to see Professor Kinneging in his office and talk to him. It was great.
Wow. Maybe we can post a link underneath the YouTube film to that interview. Kinneging isn't that much in the news, so to say, so
No.
Actually curious about what he had to say back then. But let's get back in this era now,
Sure.
2022. You've been traveling a little bit through the European Union, but maybe before we get there, because I would like you to share some ideas on how you observe us Europeans, and especially the Dutch, of course, some fundamental lines of your way of thinking, your intellectual scheme of things. Starting with the Benedict Option. Can you tell me what the book is about and why it resonates so good with people that feel alienated in the modern secularized world?
Sure. Well, to give some background, I'm a Christian. I was once a Catholic and now I'm Eastern Orthodox. But back in my Catholic days, in the early 2000s, I was working as an opinion journalist. I had worked in New York, but by the early 2000s, I was in Dallas, Texas at the Dallas Morning News. And it was hard for me to understand why our arguments never went anywhere. It was so hard to reason as a conservative with liberals and others, and I didn't understand it. Well, someone recommended that I read Alistair McIntyre's 1982 book, After Virtue. And basically in the book, McIntyre says that after the Enlightenment tried to create a transcendent sense of something from which we can all reason together, with reason alone, not with reference to religion or anything, it failed to do that. It couldn't create some binding ethic based on reason alone. And after that, we're left to live in the ruins. And the reason people can't find easily agreement is because we now live in a society based on what McIntyre called emotivism. The idea that truth is something that we arrive at through feeling and emotion. And reading this, I thought, this is it. This really goes a long way in helping me understand the crisis, the epistemic crisis and the crisis of rhetoric that we're all in. In the very end of that book, McIntyre says that we are living in a time like the fall of Rome, the Western Roman Empire. And he says that a crucial turning point in that period, that earlier period, came when men and women of virtue seceded from the wider community and went out to form smaller communities within which the tradition of the virtues could be sustained through the ages of chaos and darkness to come. McIntyre was talking about the Benedictine monks and nuns. St. Benedict of Nursia came out of Rome, out of the collapse of Rome, and founded this monastic order based on what we now call the Rule of St. Benedict. It's a simple guide for how to live in monastic community together. Well, McIntyre says at the end that we are now waiting for a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. Well, what did he mean by that? I think what he meant was we need somebody, a charismatic person or persons, to come to us and help us figure out how we can build these communities of virtue that are resilient and that can pass on the beliefs we have, religious, moral, otherwise, through this very chaotic and turbulent time. Well, I didn't know a lot about the Benedictine monks until I began to study them, and I saw that what they had done, they didn't set out to make Rome great again or, you know, to restore the empire. They only wanted to create the conditions, the social conditions, the communal conditions under which they could hold on to their faith and search for God. And what they ended up doing, though, over the few centuries after St. Benedict died, he died in the year 547, but in the next few centuries, Benedictine monasticism spread like wildfire across barbarian-ruled Western Europe. And the monks ended up slowly civilizing the places where they were. Peasants would move to live around the monasteries because they were places of order and light in a very dark and chaotic time. Eventually, these monks laid the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization in Western Europe. So my idea was, what can we Christians today, lay Christians who live in the world, we're not called to the monastery, we who live in the world, what can we learn from St. Benedict about how we can live our faith in this post-Christian era? And this was the book, The Benedict Option. Option because it's something we have to choose. I believe that all Christians, whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, if you're serious about your faith, you have to live intentionally as a Christian and with this this identity and this consciousness that you are separate from the world. If you try too hard to assimilate to the world, you're going to lose everything distinct about you. But we're not called to separate from the world completely either. So in my book, I went to talk to various Christians in Europe and in the US from different faith traditions, different confessions, to find out how they are being creative minorities. Something Pope Benedict said, that we're called to be creative minorities. And that's the book.
Very interesting. Now, in the perception of the Dutch, America is still a very religious, I would almost say country, but state, federal, big, large state.
Yeah.
So in a way, I understand this from two angles, namely there are living quite a lot of religious people in the United States, and it's such an overstretched state that you need to find ways to establish your own community. Would you then nevertheless say that it's a scheme that fits the Dutch and the Europeans? Because we are a rather small country.
The Benedict option?
Yeah.
Well, I should say...
or is it typical American in a way?
Yeah. Well, I wrote it as an American Christian for Americans, but it turns out this concept is even more popular in Europe than in America. I mean, the book sold very well in America, but it's now in 10 or 11 European languages, which surprised and delighted me. And what I found when I began coming to Europe to talk about the book, it started in 2018, with the first publication in Europe was in France. I found that my audiences for this book are almost entirely Christians aged 40 and under. Because if you still go to church and as a young person in post-Christian Europe, you're there only because you really believe. And I don't have to convince these people that Europe is a post-Christian landscape. I do have to convince Americans because so many American Christians want to believe that, yeah, things are bad now and they're declining, the young people are leaving the church in droves, but we can turn this around. In Europe, you don't have to convince people of that. The people who buy my book and come hear me talk only want to know how can we live faithfully in this landscape, in this cultural landscape. I should say too, though, Jelle, that America, the impression of America as a very religious country is completely understandable from a European point of view because it has been so for most of my lifetime. I'm 55 years old now. But that has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. For two reasons. One, or in two ways. One, the young people, that is to say those aged 40 and under in America, are leaving organized religion in massive numbers. Now, they're not becoming atheists. That's really an interesting point. But rather, they are becoming spiritual but not religious. But it's meaning the death of organized religion, of the churches. Secondly, the elites within institutions and elites within networks are thoroughly secular, and not just post-Christian, but increasingly anti-Christian. And that is driving the de-Christianization of America in a powerful way. Plus, most American Christians have no idea how to respond to this because we've been so complacent in thinking that, oh, if everything's going to be fine, if we just keep doing what we're doing, keep voting Republican, keep saying our prayers, everything's going to work out. And I think this is absolutely foolish. And they'll find out eventually how bad things are, but they will have lost all this time that they could have used to build some institutions and habits and networks of resistance. Now, you ask why Europe? As I said, it's because Christians here, and even in the Netherlands, if you want to live faithfully, you need to live in a very different countercultural way. I wish that when I was doing this book, I had heard about some of the Dutch Reformed communities here in the Netherlands. I've just learned about them in the last few days since being here. Talking to some members of them, I was thinking, this is what I'm talking about, this tight community built around the worship of God and the care for each other. It's something so simple. I'm just calling on the church to be the church, but we have forgotten that in modern times.
So, why did you, in the first place, stopped with the Catholic Church and went over to the Eastern Orthodox Church? Yeah. Because that's a major difference. In the Netherlands, we have a dominant Protestant tradition, and then the Gereformeerde or the Reformed are then its kernel, you could say. Yeah. So what happened to you that you stepped over to the Eastern Orthodox Church?
I'm glad you asked that question because it is a strange thing for Europeans. In America, we're a country of constant religious churn. I think something today like 50% of Americans are no longer in the church or even the same religion into which they were born. But this is much different in Europe. I was raised in a Protestant family in a small town in the deep south on the Mississippi River in Louisiana. We weren't very observant. We would go to church on Easter and Christmas, but that's it. So religion wasn't a big part of my life growing up. And when I became a teenager, I put it aside completely. I thought, if all Christianity is the white middle class at prayer, I want nothing to do with it. And then, when I was 17 years old, in 1984, my mother won a trip to Europe in a church contest. She bought a raffle ticket and won. She didn't want to go, but she knew I really wanted to go to Europe, to go to Paris especially to see the art museums. So she sent me. That's how I ended up as the only young person on a bus full of elderly American tourists. Well, on the way to Paris, on the coach, we stopped 1 hour outside the city to go look at an old church. And I thought, another old church, really? But I went in. This was the cathedral at Chartres. And I didn't even know what this was. There was nothing in my experience growing up in late 20th century America that prepared me for the glory of God made manifest in this medieval cathedral, in the stones and the glass. And I remember standing in the labyrinth there in the Chartres Cathedral, looking around and thinking, God exists. I know He exists, and I know He wants me. It was an overwhelming thing. All of my intellectual objections to Christianity suddenly seemed to fall away. I didn't walk out of the church as a convinced Christian, but I was on a search when I went out of there, and I wanted to know who is the God that inspired men whose names we no longer even know to build such a temple to His glory. Well, 9 years later, the search ended with me becoming a Catholic, and I became a really convinced Catholic too. I was in Washington, D.C., working then as a young journalist, and I was part of an intellectual Catholic community, and I felt I was really a culture warrior too. And it was Pope John Paul was our captain, and it was a great feeling. But then, in the early 2000s, when I was a journalist in New York City, I began to write about the abuse scandal, the sexual abuse of children. And I always thought that as long as I had the arguments for Catholicism clear in my head, my faith would be indestructible. It wasn't true. I once, early in these investigations, I talked to a very brave Catholic priest, Father Thomas Bollen, who had destroyed his church career by speaking out on behalf of victims. And after the interview, he said to me, look, Rod, I can tell you're a serious Catholic, and I want to warn you that if you continue on this path of investigation, you are going to go to places darker than you can imagine. I said, well, Father, thank you for the warning, but I feel like I have to do this to get justice for the victims, to get rid of these evil people in the church, and to make the church a good place for my own son. I had a 2-year-old boy at the time. And the priest said, oh, I want to encourage you, but you have to prepare yourself. This is evil. Well, I wasn't prepared enough for it because my faith was primarily intellectual. And it just couldn't stand all the things I would discover. I mean, I don't even want to go into it, but you can imagine the abuse of children and bishops covering up for it. And finally, I lost my ability to believe. I always thought that religious belief, if you lose your faith, it's a matter of you make a conscious intellectual decision. But for me, it was more like holding on to an iron skillet over the fire, and I finally couldn't hold on anymore. Well, as I was losing my faith, my wife was too, and we were living in Texas then. We decided to visit an Orthodox church, Eastern Orthodox, because from a Catholic point of view, the Orthodox have valid sacraments. We knew we couldn't receive the Eucharist, but we just wanted to worship God in the Eucharist and be in a beautiful, reverent liturgy without this constant anger and fear. Finally, we decided that, no, this is where we need to be. But I have to tell you, I became a very, very different kind of Orthodox Christian than I was as a Catholic. It wasn't that I thought the Orthodox Church is free of sin. No church is free of sin. But I had to change. I had been intellectually humiliated by what happened to me in losing my Catholic faith. And God revealed to me in this my own intellectual arrogance. I realized that the mind has a place within Christianity, but Christianity, first of all, has to be a religion of the heart. I had to get my heart rightly ordered and let the mind follow that. So what this has meant for me is, I think it's important to read theology and all that, but for me, I was always reading theology as a Catholic and wasn't paying attention to prayer and ways of living my daily life in a way that would have formed me as a more stable Christian. I had lots of Catholic friends who were just as angry as I was about the abuse scandal, but they didn't lose their faith. I did. So I've been Orthodox now for 16 years, and I thank God for His mercy to me as an Orthodox Christian. Once I no longer felt responsible for cleaning up the Catholic Church, I regained everything I loved about the Catholic Church, and now I tend to work more in an ecumenical sense. I'm strongly Orthodox, but I recognize the brotherhood and the sisterhood of Christians in the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches and everywhere.
Well, thank you for sharing this story of your devotion and of how you got from one church into the other and what the pain must have been. The odd or paradoxical thing is, of course, that if you want to establish new communities or want to weaponize yourself against the bureaucratic, secularized world, that you would perhaps expect from a Dutch perspective you going into a smaller church, and then these big churches, because of course the Eastern Orthodox Church is also an international community, pretty large. So,
but in the United
that's a nice thing of believing in this day and age. I think that it's both communal, local, and international. Organized. But it's also a paradox. Do you experience that?
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because in the United States, Orthodoxy is very tiny. Most Americans have no idea what it is. They tend to think that it's something with, Greek festivals, and there's no pope, and that's about it. It's some sort of special ethnic Catholicism, but that's not the case at all. But in America, it's helpful to me, because when I was a Catholic, especially coming into Catholicism in Washington, D.C., I was so impressed by the power of the Catholic Church. I thought, we have the best intellectuals. We have real power in this country, and I was interested in how the Catholic Church could use that power for the good. Well, it burned me very badly. And again, I don't blame the Catholic Church for this. I blame myself and my own orientation. It's good for me to be Orthodox, because there are only 1 million Orthodox in America, a country of 350 million people. We are a weak church. We are a tiny church. We are a powerless church in America. It's not like Russia. And that's exactly where I need to be, because it helps me to focus wholly on building my own spiritual life and working in my own local parish. But it's also great to be part of an international community. Just last week, as we're talking, I spent Orthodox Holy Week in Jerusalem. because I'm working on a new book about the re-enchantment of the world. And I thought, not only as an Orthodox Christian do I want to spend Orthodox Holy Week in the Holy City, but I wanted to be there as a journalist and as a researcher for the book to see what it's like to have the phenomenological experience of being in the Holy City where the Passion of the Christ happened with all these other Orthodox Christians. And it was just phenomenal. I remember I was standing in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is built over, it was built by Constantine originally, but it was built over the spot where Christ was crucified and also where he was buried. And I was standing there with all these Palestinian Christians, but also Christians from Greece, Romania, Russia, Serbia, from all these different countries on Holy Saturday, and we were waiting for the so-called Holy Fire miracle. It's the tradition they do. And I was overwhelmed with a sense of solidarity and a sense of blessing that this religion, which had become so deeply personal to me and which God had used to heal my heart of some really deep brokenness coming out of losing my faith in Catholicism, that I was not only experiencing this very individually, but also with these wonderful people from all over the world in the Holy City.
Wow, so it must have been a spiritual experience.
Oh, deeply, deeply. And I have to tell you, I mean, you probably didn't expect to hear this, but the day before I left Budapest for Jerusalem, I got an email from my wife saying that she had filed for divorce. And she ended our 25-year marriage with an email. And I was shocked by this, but not surprised, because the marriage has been very bad for 9 years. We fought so hard to save the marriage, but it just didn't work. Well, that's the best place to be then for an Orthodox Christian when you've gotten that news, is in Jerusalem on Holy Week.
Yeah.
And I went, as soon as I got to the city, I was staying in a hotel in the Old City. I put my bags down, and I went straight to Golgotha, the place where Christ was crucified. And there's a chapel there inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I went flat on my face and just begged God for his help, for his mercy, for me, for my wife, for our children. And I went every day there to pray for a while, to pray very sincerely in this crisis. And I felt such an overwhelming sense of peace. I have to tell you that the most important thing that happened to me there are two important spiritual things, but one of them was the simplest thing. And I think back on the story I just told you about how I was such an intellectual Catholic, and that intellectual tower I built collapsed like that. Well, on Good Friday, the Friday before Easter, I came out of my hotel room in the Old City, and there in the hallway was a chambermaid, a Palestinian chambermaid. And she was standing in front of me, and she had these deep brown eyes. And we smiled at each other, and I gave her a compliment. She was wearing a little necklace, and I said, "I love your cross necklace." And she looked at me, and she said, "It's yours." And she took it off and put it on my head. I burst into tears. I said, "I'm so sorry, but you don't know this, but I've just had a terrible shock. My wife is filing for divorce, and it was not expected, but I'm struggling with this, and you just showed me mercy." And she hugged me, and we had no deep conversations, but the fact that she showed me that little mercy made all the difference in the world. And I told her I would always wear the cross, and this is the cross here. Just something very simple. But I reflected on this, Jelle, and on how that little act of mercy from a chambermaid in a hallway of a hotel in a time of crisis meant all the world to me. And it taught me something also about intellectual humility, that somehow this love, this simple love. Oh, she said her name was Angela. She said, some people say I'm like an angel to them. She said, they tell me their sorrows, and she used her hand. She
That's
said,
a nice synchronicity, yeah?
Yeah. She said, I put them in my heart, and they don't come out. And later on Saturday night, the next night, we have the midnight liturgy it's a 5-hour liturgy on Pascha, Easter. And I was trying to find my way in the darkness through the Old City to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but I was lost, and it's easy to get lost there. And I was going down a very dark street. I saw a man standing in shadow, and I thought, oh, what if he's an angel? Then I laughed at myself, and it was just a man. But I turned around from the darkness, and I was walking back towards the lighted street and thought, if I did see an angel, what would the angel look like? I mean, I believe in angels. And as I got into the light, there was Angela, and the maid.
Once again?
Standing there once again.
Oh.
So, I'm so happy to see you. And she hugged me. She said, are you okay? I said, I'm more than okay, thanks to you. She said, thanks God. And she introduced me to her brother who was walking with her. And she said, the church you're looking for is just around the corner and to the right. And
well, it's clear, so you're a very religious man. Can you maybe, you spoke of intellectual humility, of you getting out from your head into life with existential spiritual experiences. Would you say that this has become a very difficult experience for people not believing? I mean, that maybe our society, I'm trying to bridge the gap between reflection on religion and how our society functions. But maybe due to what you just told me, I'm just brainstorming it over for myself, that maybe because people don't believe anymore, it's very difficult to get out of their heads and to endorse this humanity, to accept the fragility of life, and even having access to these emotional personal experiences is something that has become very difficult without religion.
It has. And it's interesting you bring this up. This is what the book I'm working on now is about. It has nothing to do with politics or culture. It's more about the experience of religion. How can we re-enchant the world? And I'm referring to Max Weber's famous theory that in modernity we are disenchanted. We don't believe that in God, or we don't believe that the world is sacred. Well, as an Orthodox Christian, we did not, the Church of the East did not go through the crisis of nominalism at the end of the scholastic period. We didn't have the Reformation or any of that. And in fact, the metaphysics and the everyday experience in the theology of the East is still enchanted. We have a prayer we say at every service. We address God who, quote, is everywhere present and fills all things. Now, this is a metaphysical statement. We believe that God is in some mysterious way present in this table, all around us. It's a complicated theological explanation, not worth doing, but it's about, not worth telling, but it's about enchantment. So what I'm investigating now is how can we reconnect with this capacity to experience the presence of the divine all around us. One of the things I've been learning this past spring, I've been reading books by this English psychiatrist, actually he's Scottish, psychiatrist named Ian McGilchrist. I don't know if you've ever read his book called The Master and His Emissary. Well, it's a book about neuroscience and culture. And McGilchrist's basic theory is that we have the different brain hemispheres. The left hemisphere is more analytical and abstract, and the right hemisphere is where most of the emotions are processed, but also the sort of knowledge that we get from poetry, from music, from art, from religion, things like that. In a healthy brain, they work together. They're united and balanced. We in the West, he said, have not had a healthy brain in that sense since the Enlightenment, where we have radically privileged the left hemisphere. So his idea is how can we achieve more balance? Because it turns out that we in the West are radical outliers of human experience. I don't know if you've heard of this theory called the weirdest people in the world, capital W-E-I-R-D.
Yeah.
It stands for Western, Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Democratic. It's a book by a Harvard anthropologist called Joseph Henrich, in which they discovered that most of our knowledge of human psychology comes from tests done on Western people, because this is where psychology developed. Well, they've discovered in the last 20 years that, in fact, Western psychology is radically different from psychology of people all around the world. And I have seen this too. We find it so difficult in the West to be open to religious experience and numinous experience, things that are easier for people in other cultures around the world to do. So what I'm working on now is to figure out how can we do this in the West? How can we regain our ability to sense the presence of the divine?
Oh. Now, you have this psychologist in America called Jonathan Haidt, who actually says this weird morality, so een beetje de NRC Handelsblad moraal, zal ik maar zeggen, the morality of the established academic elite, who tends to reduced morality, so to say, to the most important kernel that all people would definitely accept, do not do harm, and be honest. But hate argues there are actually more layers, sentiments in our morality. For instance, the appreciation of hierarchy, of tradition, and very important, holiness.
Yeah, purity and holiness. Yeah,
yeah, and he also interprets this as in a secularized way, so to say. So certain things are experienced holy. For instance, burning a flag of a soccer club or a country.
Sure.
So the word people would say, well, that's not a moral act. That's a stupid thing to do, or maybe you provoke somebody. But hate argues, no, that's actually very immoral to do. But not all people perceive this.
Yeah.
And I like the argument because it's not only the Western person that is the white Western educated Protestant or Protestant man, the zevenvinker, we also say in Dutch, is dominant in psychological discourse. No, it's only a certain academic leftish secularized white person. I like that hate thesis because I recognize it. I see a lot of people around me that endorse other types of moralities.
Well, what is wokeness? But
yeah, that's part of the woke debate as well. So
sure.
It's about monopolization of morality. Whereas this hate, for instance, or the person you referred to, what's his name again?
Ian McGilchrist.
McGilchrist.
Yeah, his most famous book is called The Master and His Emissary. It refers to the brain hemispheres. Yeah. But he has a new book out called The Matter with Things, where he expands on the argument about culture and brain hemispheres and takes it into metaphysics. It's really interesting. But what Haidt says, that he was so onto things, and it really made sense to me reading Jonathan Haidt about why we're clashing all the time and don't understand it in American life, especially as a professional journalist. I mean, in the US, most journalists are very much on the secular left. I was always a weirdo as a religious conservative in journalism, but I was always treated fairly. But you know that you're a minority and people don't see things the way that you do. But what used to really make me angry working in newsrooms is how so many journalists, as secular liberals, they thought that they were the paradigm of being open-minded and searching. In fact, they were just as closed-minded as anybody else, but maybe they were in a worse condition because they were under the illusion that they were really tolerant and open-minded, and it was just false. But with the wokeness thing, I think wokeness is best understood as a form of religion and a form of purity religion, using Haidt's categories. Because what do the woke do? They're part of a movement that seeks total purity. They want to rid the world of evil, evil as defined by racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever. And they are apocalyptic in their approach. They say, we cannot tolerate evil, we must do this, we must have a violent action to rid the world of this evil. Now, they don't refer to God at all, but they're sacred, the things that are sacred to them are minorities, racial and sexual minorities. But it should be understood as religion. And this is why you can't argue with them. I remember, I think one of the key turning points in our cultural debate, or in the culture war and debate over wokeness, came in October of 2015 at Yale University. Of course,
at that time, we had never heard of it.
No, and we didn't use the word wokeness then either. But at Yale University, clearly one of the world's most important universities, the university sent out, just before Halloween, an email to all the students saying that take care about the costumes you wear. You might offend somebody with your costume. Be very careful. Well, at the university, students live in certain houses, and some of these houses have house parents who are usually academics, an academic couple. Well, there was this one house at Yale that was, the house parents were the Christakises, Nicholas and Erica Christakis. They were very distinguished academics. Erica is one of the top experts in juvenile psychology. Well, she sent a letter commenting on this to all the 50 kids or so living in her house. She said, is this really the responsibility of a university to tell adults, as you all are, what you can and can't wear on Halloween? You should be respected to make your own decision. Right. When I was in college, we would have said, thank you for that. Not these kids today. They went berserk. They attacked her. How can you be so callous to us? How can you not care about our feelings? You should be protecting us. Well, you can see on YouTube, there was a conflict or a clash on the campus between Professor Christakis, the husband, Nicholas Christakis, a white-haired baby boomer era guy, and the students. And Professor Christakis is trying to reason with them to say, like, this is what we see. Tell us what you think, and let's go back and forth. These kids are not having it. They reacted like a mob of religious fanatics. You can see them on the video screaming and crying and cursing him, like he had just insulted their God. No. And I realized watching this is the end of rationality. This is the end of academia, because this poor man Christakis was trying to have a dialogue. They didn't want dialogue. They wanted him to apologize. No. They wanted repentance, and they wanted submission.
Rod, how do you explain, or how do you interpret the intolerance of the tolerant? Well, they pretend to be very tolerant and to protect the vulnerable, but at the same time, it has become very totalitarian, as you also called in your books. Soft totalitarianism.
Yeah. I think it's about anxiety, to be honest, about managing anxiety. They feel, like many of us do, adrift in a sea of liquid modernity. The phrase belongs to Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, where nothing is solid, and this terrifies them. It scares everybody, but they have no religious faith to fall back on. All the institutions, the hierarchies that have traditionally given a sense of structure and stability, they're all in flux. They're all up for question. And this is how young people especially are managing their anxieties, by trying to banish them.
So political ideology as also a Jonathan Haidt thesis, as a ersatz religion of the church.
As a pseudo-religion, and also as a therapeutic exercise. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I had a European journalist friend who was at Harvard University for a year on a special graduate program for journalists, and they would bring maybe 50 a year, half from Europe, half from the US, to spend 1 year taking graduate courses at Harvard. And I happened to be in Boston as my friend's fellowship was coming to an end, so I invited him to lunch. First question was, what is the most important thing you learned here at America's top university for a year? He said to me, how fragile the American ruling class is. I said, really? What do you mean by that? He said that when I first got to Harvard, we would go to these classes, and the professors would say things to the students like, today, class, we will not talk about this topic and that topic, because some of you came to me before class and said that it would be very distressing and you would be triggered if we talked about it. So we're not going to talk about it. My friend said all of us Europeans looked at each other like, wait, is this guy real? Is he serious? Well, yeah, he was serious. And this went on from class to class to class.
Self-censorship.
Yeah. And they demanded censorship, and the professors gave it to them. And my European friend said that the Harvard student newspaper published some statistics showing that the overwhelming number of Harvard students were on some kind of antidepressant drug. Now, my friend said the thing is, none of these students in graduate study at Harvard doubted for 1 second that their destiny was to join the ruling class and to rule America. At the same time, they could not tolerate any idea that gave them anxiety, and they expected authority to intervene to protect them from having to confront difficult ideas. My European friend said, look, I'm going back to Europe in a couple of weeks, but my country depends on America being strong. And that's why I fear, he said, for my country, because you're going to be ruled by crazy people.
Yeah, about that craziness and anxiety, can you unpack a little bit more how you interpret the idea of therapy and the the dominance of a therapeutic self-perception in the US?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's massive. It's massively important, and this is really we're only now starting to appreciate it more.
But it has been a long trend. For instance, McIntyre in After Virtue already criticizes therapy as a praxis, as a shallow spiritual practice.
Well, and you go back to Philip Rieff, the secular Jewish intellectual. He wrote a fantastic book in 1966 called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And Rieff was a Freudian. He died in 2008, but he said that at some point in the 20th century, we lost religion in the West, but we replaced religion with psychology. We quit believing, at least at the elite level, and this eventually went out to all of society. He said we quit believing that the purpose of man is to seek virtue and to live virtuously. He said we quit believing that that could even be known. Instead, we began to see that the proper goal of man is to learn how to moderate his anxieties in the face of meaninglessness. So Reef was saying that in 1966 that all of this was coming. He said that the churches in America don't even know what's happening now, but in fact they're turning into therapy centers. Well, if you read Reef's book, it's so prophetic. It is amazing how everything he said that was happening was going to happen.
But isn't it also some part of the truth that churches used to be therapeutic centers?
Yeah.
All the way back to the Middle Ages. So what do you mean
Even
exactly with?
Well, I think this is an important distinction. And a former Orthodox priest of mine put it this way. He said, the church really is a field hospital. People come to be cured. The problem is that when they show up and they want to be cured, you can tell them as a priest, he said, you can be cured, but you have to undergo surgery and it's going to hurt, but you will get better in the end. Nobody wants that. In fact, all they really want, most of them, is some sort of opioid to mask the pain without having to deal with the source of the pain. And that's what Reef was talking about, that this is what religion had become in modern America. And not just religion, but every aspect of American culture had been about the therapeutic, about reorganizing emotions to deal with anxiety. Well, now this has been, in the last 50 years or so, it has been sort of veiled, but now it is out in the open completely. And we have this therapeutic politics that's not, it has gone from being a soft form of therapy about emotivism and things like that to being something really quite radical.
And from a therapeutic perspective, for instance, then you cannot say true things to people or voice your opinion because that might not be accepted, might be interpreted as it's not something I like, or now I'm hurt. Is that what you mean? A
personal attack. And now it's gone so far that even refusing to say words, silence equals violence. I mean, it's madness. This past week, as we're talking, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, his former partner, it's been some sort of trial, and
a big thing in America.
And there was a psychiatrist who testified that the wife, Amber Heard, has something called borderline personality disorder, and with borderline personality disorder, everything is high emotions with them. Their emotions define their reality. And I was listening to some of this testimony and reading about it. I thought, our entire culture has gone this way. And if you look at transgender, for example, this is something so radical, and it has come so fast. The idea that we can determine who is male and who is female, the most fundamental biological fact about the human species, that it is all a matter of feeling. And if we just change the words and change the law and even do some medical processes, et voila, you can reverse this fact. And if you don't agree with this, then you are a bigot and a hater, and you must be banished.
What do you think of the counter-argument that, I'm just wondering what you would say, that transgender ideas have become some kind of a fetish of conservative authors that keep writing about it, while at the same time not a lot of people go into transition. Mm-hmm. The pro-argument would be, I would say, that it's all a very a small group that other of those New York-based journalists write a lot about, so the LGBT community, whereas in practice it's only a small community that's just getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, but
or is this a big thing and it's not just a fetish of, proponent and opponent journalists?
It's a massive thing, and this is the typical strategy of the left. It works like this. I subscribe to the New York Times, have subscribed for decades to the Times, read the Washington Post, and so forth. They're constantly, for the last 10 years, have constantly been going on and on and on about LGBT. And so it's like they say to us, gay, 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 trans, 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 gay, gay, trans. And you say, gay, trans? They say, why are you so obsessed, you bigot? This is how it works. And in fact, we can prove it. A young man named Zachary Goldberg, a political science PhD student in Georgia, he did a search on the Nexus Lexis database, which is where all the journalism goes into, He did a search of key woke terms like white supremacy, transgender, gender identity, things like that. He found that around 2012, 2013, the charts went from this to this, straight up, because suddenly all the media were obsessing over all of these things, pushing it into discourse.
How come? Where does this come from? Is this related to this therapeutic development in our culture? What's the source?
I think that it's clearly related to the therapeutic development, but I don't really know what triggered it in 2012 and 2013. Maybe it was the entrance of a certain generation of kids who are radicalized in university into the professional workplace. I think a big part of it had to do with the old-fashioned liberals who were the guardians of the institutions, journalistic and otherwise, collapsed in the face of the pressure from the radical students. You know, and I can tell you for a fact, journalism standards have collapsed because these older liberals are terrified of the radical students.
Let me share another thought with you, and just wondering what you think about it. Maybe it entered the public realm because, in a way, it's the next step in the process of individualization.
Yeah.
Because so if you don't live in communities anymore, but in a mass society, and you want to you want to flourish from your individuality, which is also very therapeutic, of course, this authentic experience. At one time, you just decide for yourself, because earlier on you talked about emotions, but it's also a very rational discourse. Yeah. Like I woke up and I thought about it, and I think I want to be a man or a woman. I think about this. I don't. So the body is
a form of abstraction.
It's a form of abstraction from the own body. So and in a way, it's just there's because you also write about this in your book, the big cultural developments, Descartes, Reformation, and so forth. You can also see this in this larger development, namely that maybe this is already in a way readable in the works of the philosopher Descartes, who thinks that he in essence is a person that thinks, and the rest is, so to say, a choice. So in a way, you could say this wokish discourse of trans had to come at some day, because it fits fluently in the process of the disenchanted individual.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. That's really a good line of thought. And I think in that sense, it's probably no accident that this sort of thing began to break big into American culture only 7 years after the smartphone debuted. The iPhone was introduced in 2007, and suddenly you had an entire generation that had lived most of their lives, or much of their lives, completely online, abstracted. I recently did an interview with this young woman named Helena Kirshner in the US. She's a detransitioner. She's 23 years old. When she was 18, she decided she was really a man and began to take hormones and live as a man. But then she changed her mind, and now she's quite active against the transitioning minors. And it's fascinating what she had to say. She said that she got into this because she was, as typical for a lot of intelligent kids, she felt very alienated and alone in high school. Well, she found this Tumblr online, a tumblr.com community, a trans community, and she was told there that you, as a heterosexual white woman, you are the lowest of the low, but you can redeem yourself if you become queer. And it wasn't quite that crude, but she said it was so clear that if I wanted to be part of this community, to be affirmed by this community, to get rid of everything I hated about myself, because she was a teenager, and you hate yourself, I could be redeemed if I would change my identity. And eventually, she said, the more radical you would transgress the givenness of your body, the greater affirmation you would get and the greater sense of meaning. She said it was narcotic. Suddenly, I felt that online in this abstract community that was telling me these things, I had a sense of meaning and substance. She said when she turned 18, she went to Planned Parenthood, and they prescribed for her. No doctor saw her. No doctor ever saw her or evaluated her. They gave her the strongest possible injections of testosterone.
Yeah,
and she went on to talk about how this made her crazy. The point simply is this. She talks about how she found in her radical isolation and atomization, she found community, she found meaning, and she found the capacity to act, or she thought so, to act to give a better life for herself by changing her body. It was all a lie, but she said, it comes from somewhere. It's not just simply a matter of a crazy fad for kids. It's coming from this deep sense of anxiety and loneliness and atomization and, as you say, individualization. And I should say,
there's some typical radical American spirit in it. So some do it with sports, for instance, radically transform their bodies, but within the threshold of being a man or a woman.
It's the inability to accept limits. That's it. And this is what it means.
Interesting thing.
This is what it means to be American, and this is what it means to be modern.
And what's up with this difference between your generation, you're 55, you told me, and now the millennials or the centennials? So what's up with those people in America, 21 years old, also crossing borders? I mean, why have they become so radical compared
kids
to
these days? I think it's because, well, we mentioned earlier Zygmunt Bauman and the theory of liquid modernity. Bauman's basic theory was that in modern times things began, the rate of change sped up significantly. We became unmoored, unanchored from traditions and institutions and so forth. And as modernity has gone on and as technological progress has increased, the experience of time has become such that before new institutions and new ways of life can become solid, they change again. So we have this experience of time, and all human experiences, nothing is solid. I think this has become even more the case with my kids' generation, than with mine. We also have lived through the end of the Cold War, and the Cold War was what I grew up with, and there was something, as bad as it was, there was something very fixed and comforting about knowing they are the evil ones, we are the good ones, this is the meaning of our life, this struggle. I mean, thank God it was over and we got through it without nuclear war, but I realize now, looking back on it, that was a conflict that gave a sense of stability. Suddenly, these kids don't have stability. And we had 9/11. I lived in New York back then. I was standing on the Brooklyn Bridge that morning and watched the South Tower come down. And when I got back home an hour later to my apartment in Brooklyn, my wife had thought I was dead because she couldn't reach me on the phone. I was covered with ash and in shock. Well, my children, I had one child then. He was maybe 2 years old. I've had 2 more children. All of these kids have grown up knowing nothing but war. That we live, even though the war is far away for Americans, and they've known nothing but instability. We had given them a stable home. Well, thank God that now we're divorcing, that they're a lot older. But I think that this generation doesn't have any sense of stability, and they're overwhelmed by a culture of choice. My kids have grown up. My oldest is 22, born in 1999. They have grown up in a media environment in which they have pushed, made a holy cause of gay marriage and now transgenderism. So the media, I've always tell people that media bias isn't a matter of them telling you what to believe. Media sets the framework for what the discussion can be, what is permitted and what isn't. Well, these kids and all kids in America have grown up in a media environment in which you can choose whatever you want. Your body isn't stable. You can, modernity has entered into your body.
That's on the left progressive side of the debate, but if I would situate you in the culture wars with being a writer for the American conservative, I mean, you also have the other part of the media that inspires you to live in a different way, isn't it? I would say that compared to the Netherlands, you have this diet of media that allows you to find inspiration in other ideas. Christianity, tradition, that's also... Well, isn't that also on Fox News and in American Conservative, or do I have a misperception of this culture war?
Well, this is one of the things, as a conservative, that frustrates me about my own side, is we, American conservatives, are much more liberal in the classical sense than we realize. We're really right liberals. And if you see how so many American conservatives live, it's not so different from how liberals live. It's all about individualism. They just have rearranged their prejudices. They don't believe that they are bound by anything that is not chosen. They're very modern. We're very modern. And look, it's hard to escape this. Look at me. I don't want to be hypocritical. I was born into a Protestant family, non-practicing, but still Protestant. I became Catholic, and now I'm Orthodox of all things. married thinking I was going to last forever, and now I suddenly find myself the subject of divorce. I can't be hypocritical and say that I'm not a modern person too, but I think the one thing that might distinguish me is at least I try to be aware that this is not how it should be, that we have to try to find some roots and establish some roots and build forms of community and ways of life that are stable. You know, even as I recognize that we don't have the power by force of will to do this on our own. And I think that, you know, in my work, what I've tried to do is to define the problem and to say, look, I'm searching too, but we have to search together.
We're on the quest, to speak with McIntyre again. But yeah, we're all on the search, so the quest, to quote McIntyre again. So the quest, finding stability in an unstable liquid modernity.
Yeah, and we have to, I think one difference between conservatives, or at least traditionalists, and liberals is, I believe the quest is for a quest for transcendence, for a transcendence that is actually out there. I believe in God, and I believe that we can know God, and that our ancestors have ways of teaching us how to go on this pilgrimage. But so many liberals, and even some people on the right who are secular, they believe the quest is only within, that there is nothing to see out there, that the world is, the metaphysically, it's just dead, and we have to go into the self and find ways to authenticate the self. I'm for the quest that takes us outside of ourselves.
From therapy to metaphysics.
Yeah, to get us out of our head. This is one of the great challenges of my own life, religiously and intellectually, is to how to step out of my head and into the real world and to integrate the two realms. And I think I'll be struggling with this the rest of my life, as many of us will.
Yeah. Getting onto earth with an eye on the heavens.
Well, I'll tell you one last story. When I was coming into the Catholic Church in the early 1990s, I was working at my first job at a newspaper. There was a woman there, a photographer, who said, "Oh, I hear you're interested in Catholicism. I'm a Catholic. Why don't you come work with me this weekend at the soup kitchen from the Missionaries of Charity?" And I thought, Mother Teresa's order, oh, that sounds very Catholic. I'll go. So I went to the soup kitchen on a Saturday. I chopped carrots, I peeled potatoes, and that was it. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe some sort of mystical nun to float through and bless me. I don't know, but I thought, you know, this is kind of boring. I know it's a good thing to do, but I'm more of an intellectual. My time would be better spent reading books. Well, 13, 14, 15 years later, when my Catholic faith was in ruins, I thought if I had gone back to the soup kitchen, which I never did, if I'd gone back to the soup kitchen or done in some way, lived out my faith, made it more incarnate instead of intellectually abstract, maybe I would have been more resilient in the face of this destruction of the abuse scandal. And so as an Orthodox Christian, I've tried not to make that mistake, tried to live my faith out in a more concrete way.
Experience life.
Yeah, not just in my head, but it's a matter of conversion for all of us in late modernity, especially if we're more intellectual. You know, we have to get out of our heads and experience the real world.
Rod, thank you for sharing your story with us.
Oh, it was a great pleasure.
Here in Leiden. Vond je dit ook een interessant gesprek? Abonneer je dan vooral op ons kanaal. Dan krijg je iedere keer als eerste nieuwe gesprekken. Bedankt voor het kijken en tot ziens.